Services. Let's take a look on how to create a service in the DataMiner system and add that service layer on top of our element layer we already created previously. Let's take a look at that. So first of all, in the services module, we will take a look at what services exactly is, and then we'll dive into adding a service to our DataMiner system. And we'll wrap it up with taking a quick look at some of the highlighted features here. So first of all, a service is a combination of different elements that are responsible for delivering a specific service, typically to my end customers. So I could have a whole chain of elements responsible, and that chain could also be dynamic, meaning that I could have a main path and a backup path, or some devices are redundant. So there might be some dynamic behavior in the elements. We can all incorporate that into the services. Now, what will that bring this to me? Well, I have a first scenario here with a number of elements, and one of them is generating a critical alarm. I have a second scenario with a bunch of elements, and again, I have another element which is generating a critical alarm. From a first perspective, this could be quite identical. I have a critical situation in the first scenario and in the second scenario. But if I add that service layer on top of my elements and see what the impact is on the services that I'm delivering to my customers, I could see that in the first scenario, only one service is actually impacted by this critical alarm. While in the second scenario, you have a whole series of services which are impacted by this critical element alarm here. So this one is apparently like a core element, like a core switch or something, and it immediately impacts a whole series of my services. So I'll first go to the second alarm here and try to fix that one before I will take a closer look at the first alarm here, if I need to make a choice, of course. So services adds that additional perspective that I can see what the actual status of the services that I'm delivering to my customers. We can also attach graphical presentations to that. The services can also have properties like a gold, silver, bronze service. They also have their own alarm history, so that I can easily go back and say, like, show me the alarms of yesterday, and it will nicely indicate which alarms were happening on the elements that were in use or were doing the job at that point in time. So it nicely keeps track of that dynamic behavior as well. Now let's take a look on how we can add a service to our DataMiner system. So previously we already created an element and a view, so therefore it's quite similar. We just right click anywhere on the surveyor where you want to add the service. So you right click there, you go to the new menu, and you do have there, which we already used, the view and the element. You now also have that service item in there. And that opens up the wizard that allows you to immediately add your service. As always, we give it a nice meaningful name, of course, and you could also optionally give it a description. Note, if you have multiple DataMiner systems, or DataMiner agents, I should say, you might need to choose there the DataMiner agent where you want to install this service on. So a service is also hosted on one specific DataMiner node or DataMiner agent in your system. You do have, again, the possibility to replicate. As with elements, you do have the possibility to say, like, I don't want to create a brand new service, because it is actually already available on another DataMiner system I have. Then you can say, like, okay, let's replicate it from that other system. I need to connect to a specific IP address or DNS or hostname with a specific username and password. I can retrieve the services, pick, for instance, the BBC service, let's say, from that other DataMiner system, and you will have it in your DataMiner system here. So instead of creating it twice, you can actually kind of like reference an existing service. You do have at the bottom there the advanced section, which you can open up. It includes a small option whether you want to include the timeouts of the elements of your service, yes or no. And optionally, you can also attach a service protocol to your service. What it means is normally a service, a basic service as we call it, will just combine the alarms and the alarm statuses of the elements that are included at that point in time and show you a summary and keep track of whatever is happening there with the alarms and the alarm history, etc. But if you actually want to do a little bit more and generate alarms on a service level, you do need to attach a service protocol or service definition, as we call it, to your element, to your service. I'll play around with that and I show you what the difference is. In an example, I will first create a basic service, show you how it looks like, and then I will enhance it with a service, attaching a service definition to it. Then we call it an enhanced service, and then it can also generate alarms on a service level while there are no alarms on the elements included in it. I'll show you how that works. Now, the next thing we need to do after specifying the name of the service is define the content. In there we need to say like, okay, what needs to be included? Typically, I have a whole series of elements which are responsible for this service, and I just add all of those elements. So you can just at the bottom add elements and just select any of the elements you have in your DataMiner system. Okay. You do also have the possibility to add a group. Why is that interesting? Well, I mentioned that it can be dynamic, a service, if it follows a main or a backup path. So you can define for an element if it's included or not at a specific, with a specific condition, maybe depending on a switch or something. Well, if you have a whole series of elements, you can make a group, and then you can also define the dynamic behavior, the inclusion, exclusion on the group. If it follows the main path, the whole series of main devices is included. If it follows the backup path, the whole series of backup elements are being used. So it's a little bit to keep it more easier to manage and more organized that you can use groups. Note we define here in the tab page parameters. Well, that's actually because you can, I will immediately come back to that. You can include an element as a whole, if the whole element is responsible for this service, or only a part of the element should be included. For instance, you can say like, okay, that's only one port of a switch that needs to be included. So you can actually make it smaller. And therefore you can actually also include an element more than once and say, depending on a certain condition, I include port 1 or I include port 2 of that switch. I'll come back with some examples as well. So on this page, we will define and add more elements in there that are responsible for delivering my service to my customers. Now, once I add some elements, you will have for each element or group this panel available on the right-hand side where you can specify some details. I'll do that in an example as well, but maybe let's first step through it. The first thing I have for a group, I can give it a name, but also for an element, I can give it an alias. And why is that? Because sometimes the elements in my system are a little bit more cryptic names, and here I can assign a name which is more meaningful in the context of this service. So that's why you can kind of like override the element name with an alias. The next thing I need to define is whether the element is included as a whole, everything of the element, or if it's only a part of the element, like for instance, the parameters of one port of a switch. And then I have some possibilities to define the dynamic behavior. By default, if you add an element, it will always be included and it will always be in use. You do have the possibility to say like, yeah, well, actually, it's not always that it needs to be included in my service. It actually depends on a switch. If the switch is pointing to position 1 or 2, it will define whether this element needs to be included, yes or no. So that's why you can add some conditions here and you can define depending on a parameter value, for instance, whether it needs to be included. There's also a possibility that you say like, okay, it's not just included and excluded, but I also have something like in use and not in use. And that has a little bit of different impact on the service alarm state. And that comes also together with the possibility to cap the alarming here. Let me show you with an example how that exactly works. Over here we see our service business TV. And it has two elements in there, the Paris main and the Paris backup. The Paris main is indicated with a regular font color, and it is included and so-called also in use. So that's the default thing. If I put an element in there, it will by default be included. The Paris backup, although, is a little bit dimmed out. And actually this one is still included, it's still shown here underneath the service name, but it is dimmed out, so it's not currently in use. And maybe there's even another backup or another site which I actually don't see because that's excluded. If it's excluded, it won't be shown underneath the service, so you won't see it here, and it won't have any impact on the service color coding, the alarm color, and it won't have any service impact on the alarms those elements are generating. So excluding is completely excluding, and that's defined in this first condition here, whether it is included or excluded. So both the main and the backup are just included. We didn't use any exclusion here, but maybe the Brussels will be excluded and it is not being shown here at the moment. I'll show you in a demo as well. Now, the main is in use, the backup is not in use. What is the big difference? Well, the main, the color of the main, the critical alarm, will bubble up to the business TV, while for the backup, it won't bubble up to the business TV. Indeed, but what we did here is we actually defined a cap so that the critical is not bubbling up to the service, but it is actually a major because the maximum severity of the included elements is by default critical. So normally I'm expecting the critical to bubble up, but you do have the possibility to change this critical here to, for instance, major, and that's the example we have done here. We said like, yeah, if the main device is critical, it's only a major alarm on the business TV. That is potentially interesting, for instance, that you say like, okay, yeah, from a device perspective, it is critical, but from a service perspective, it's not critical. Or maybe this Paris main device is included in two services. In one, it's a critical alarm. In the other, it's maybe not a critical alarm because it's in a different context. It's a different service. So if it is included, you do have the possibility to set a cap on the maximum severity. By default, everything goes up, but in this case, we made a major cap for bubbling up. If it is not included or not in use, I should say, then you normally have a cap on normal. They are basically suppressed. You cannot have any alarms from the devices that are not in use. So if an element is not in use, normally it doesn't bubble up the alarm, and that's a little bit what we see here. The Paris will normally have a green arrow going up, but actually in this example here, we changed this to a warning alarm. Why is that? Well, we could say like, yeah, if an alarm happens on the backup, we don't want it to bubble up to the service. Yes, okay, a critical alarm is not immediately a critical alarm on my service because it's not in use, so it doesn't really matter. But on the other hand, we do want to have our backup to be in good shape so that it can kick in whenever it has to kick in. So therefore, you can actually say, well, if a critical alarm happens on a device which is not in use, I still want to maybe have it bubbling up, not as a normal here, but as a warning, so that I can still see a little bit of impact on my service, indicating that my backup is not standing by to do the job whenever something would happen. Once again, I'll show that in a demo in just a second and go through that step by step once more and building that up. The next page is then the views. So typically it will already be in the correct view if you right-clicked on your correct view to add it into your tree structure somewhere. And it is also possible to assign properties to a service. And of course, with drag and drop editing, you can still change your the position of your service later on as well. So let's take a look at that. We have an exercise here, but I actually will build it up a little bit step by step. So previously we had the Isaham site created within there a couple of elements. Well, actually in the meantime, I just quickly added a site switch, allowing me to do a main backup switch on site 1 and a main backup switch on site 2. And I can switch between site 1 and site 2. So I do have some flexibility here to do a little bit of switching with a service that I will create. That being said, let's go ahead and create our first service. So I'll right click on the Isaham view and I go to new service. So I go for new service. It opens up the page and I can immediately give it a name, for instance, business TV. Optionally description, I only have one DataMiner agent, so that's simple. No choice there. It will include the timeouts of the elements. That's perfectly fine. And later on, I will come back to this and make it an enhanced service. I'll first leave that as it is by default. Don't specify a protocol to make it a basic service. Let's first check out the basic service. Now I can go to the next page, the parameters, and I can start adding my elements in here. So what I will do is I will add some elements of the Paris view, Paris IRD1 and IRD2. So note they are not disappearing here because I can add an element more than once. So it is possible to add IRD1 twice so that I can say like, yeah, a part of the element is added dynamically depending on certain conditions, and another part of the element, like a second port, is added depending on other conditions, so that you can actually have one or the other going in or out your service. But I'll just keep it simple and just add the two IRDs in there. So I can just add two IRDs in there, and I can just immediately create maybe already created and take a look at it without doing anything else. So it's going to be in the Isaham view, and I can immediately define some properties as well. Let's already take a look at that. So I created a business TV and I have my two IRDs in there, and they immediately show me what the status is. But of course, it's only one or the other that is doing the job. So I want to have a little bit of dynamic behavior in there. And actually, I want to create two sites as well because I have site redundancy. So let's go and take it a step further. So I'll click on the hamburger menu to go to my edit again and go to the parameters again. Now to add that dynamic behavior, I want to create two sites, Paris and Brussels. So I will add a group. So let me add a group in there and I will give it the name Paris. And I will add another group and I will add in there the group Brussels. Note the elements, they cannot be moved. So let me just remove them and now select Paris and add the elements in there once more. Paris, IRD1, IRD2. Okay, so now I added them inside one, and I can do the same thing for Brussels. I can select Brussels, add element, and I can filter on Brussels, select IRD1 and IRD2. Okay, perfect. I created two sites with Paris 1 and 2 and Brussels 1 and 2. The first thing I have is the alias. So let me make that a little bit more meaningful because 1 and 2, that doesn't say a lot. So what I will do is I will specify for each of my elements in the name immediately if it's the main or the backup, because maybe it's IRD 36 and I don't really know if that's the main or the backup. So let me nicely give that all an alias. Okay. So now I created all of the necessary elements. I can apply that. You will see your business TV will now include all of the elements. And I said main twice. So let's go back to the editing and fix that problem. Right click, edit, parameters, Brussels main should be Brussels backup, of course. Okay. Now what I will do is I will add my first dynamic behavior, and that's defining which one is doing the job, Brussels or Paris, depending on the site switch I have. So Brussels is going to be my main site. So I say that this group is included in the service. Always, no, not always. Depending, it is included depending on a condition. Which kind of condition? You can go for an alarm state or an element alarm state, but I'm going for a parameter value, whether it's on site 1 or site 2. I do have in Isaham created my switch, the site switch, and I have a parameter there, switch site selection, and if it's site 1 or site 2. So I'll define that Brussels is included if it's site 1, and I go to Paris and I will do exactly the same there, and I will say Paris is included based on a condition of a parameter of my Isaham switch, and the switch site selection equal to site 2, of course. Let me play around with that. So I added some dynamic behavior in there, and we can see that now we have our Brussels site, which is active. Let me open up my site switch and switch to our site 2, and you will see that the business TV changes to the Paris site that is included now. So you can easily click on the button there to just switch over the site, and the service nicely follows. And if I open up the service, it just shows me the site which is doing the job. Perfectly okay. Let's go back to the editing and take it a step further. So now I added some dynamic behavior with inclusion and exclusion. Not yet the in use or not in use. I'll do that with the main and backup that is inside a site. Because if Brussels is doing the job, I completely kick out Paris. But if Brussels is doing the job, I want to indicate which one is actually doing the job now, because I have a main and a backup, but I don't really see which one is in use. So I want to indicate that the main or the backup is in use. So that I will do again with a dynamic behavior. But now I will leave it included, but I say once included, will it influence the overall alarm state? Yes or no. So that's the in use, not in use. Again, on a parameter value of the Isaham site switch, which is going to be now a switch of site 1 that I will check, because the switch site 1 allows me to switch between main and backup, indicate if the main or the backup is doing the job. So the main is going to be included and influence the overall alarm state, depending on the site switch 1 being main, and for the backup, that's exactly the same thing. Parameter value of the Isaham site switch, the site 1 is the backup now in this case, of course. Let me apply that and take a look at that. So now it is updating, and you can see that the backup is now a little bit dimmed out. Let me open up this one in new cards so that I can easily switch there as well. So let me switch from main to backup. You will see the backup will now do the job, and the main will go in an excluded or not excluded, not in use state. So you can also have it here indicated that the main now is not in use. Let me switch back to the main. Now the main is in use and the backup is not in use. Okay, so let me go back and further refine my configuration. So I already did it on a group level, the inclusion, exclusion. On the element level inside Brussels, I defined a in use, not in use. And now I can also do the same thing on Paris, which is going to be exactly the same thing. But what I also want to show here is the maximum severity that is included, yes or no. So now by default, your maximum severity of an included element, like the Brussels main here, is critical. And for an element not in use, for the backup, is normal. Let's check that out and generate an alarm on the main. Let's just generate a random alarm here. Critical, if my main goes critical, my service immediately goes critical as well. Okay, let's go back. Let's do the same thing on our backup device. So on our backup device, if we generate a critical alarm, no alarm is bubbling up, and this is indicated with the green arrow because it is being kept at normal when the element is not in use. Now let's tweak that to verify the results, and let's go back to our main device, put this one on major, and for the element not in use on warning. Now I said that the not in use can actually bubble up a warning towards the top. So in this case, if I will now generate an alarm, let's go back to a normal state, generate an alarm. Did I not apply that? Let me quickly go back. Parameters, Brussels. Yeah, I did it on the main, not on the backup. So the backup should of course also have the warning, and here major if you want to have it completely correct. So now you can see that the critical alarm of the backup device is bubbling up as a warning towards my business TV. So my business TV is still okay, it's still in good shape. I'm running on the main, but still it shows, watch out, there's a warning alarm here because my backup device is not in a good shape. So you can still bubble up that critical alarm from your not in use device towards the top. Let me clear this alarm again, and let me generate another alarm on the main device, the one which is doing the job, a critical alarm. Remember that I set a cap on there so that only a major alarm can go up. So in this case, you can now see that only a major goes up to the top. Okay, so that's what you can do with that capping of that alarms at the bottom here of your element configuration. One last thing that I did not mention is the all parameters. So by default, when you add an element in there, it adds the whole element in there. So all of the parameters, you do have the possibility to define a sub-selection and define like, yeah, only those parameters, this section of an element is responsible and relevant in this service context. So you can define that with the all parameters. Okay, so remember when you add an element, you can also add groups to make it more easy and define it on groups as well. But if you add an element, you can give it an alias. You can decide whether you include it completely or partial. And then you say the first thing, is it always included or maybe sometimes just completely kicked out, like Paris is currently kicked out. Or you can also say, well, no, it remains included, but like the main and the backup, it is actually in use or not in use depending on certain conditions. And if it is in use or not in use, you can still have certain capping on the alarms when it is included and the alarms when it is not in use. Okay, that's all great and well, but I can still see that actually the service, it is a combination of alarms that are existing in your elements. Now let's assume that I want to indicate in my service. Now my service is back perfectly okay. That I want to indicate that I'm switching to a backup. Because if I'm switching, I'm now running on the backup. Let's assume that I want to indicate this with an alarm that there is actually a not perfectly okay solution. So then I would actually need to generate alarms on the service instead of the elements. So by default, a basic service is just combining the element alarms and showing that on a service object. With enhanced services, you do have the possibility to generate also alarms on the service layer independent of the elements that are included. Let me show you. So now I just have in my business TV, my Brussels main and backup, and the Paris is not even visible because it's currently excluded. Now let's go back to the editing and do that one final change there, that is in the advanced assigning a service definition to this service that I'm creating here. We do have two service definitions available. A service definition is managed the same way as a protocol. In the same list, you can add service definitions, and it uses the same definition file to define what needs to be in there. So what I will do, I will just go for the Skyline service basic definition, and I'm just going to add that. And I'll immediately also add an alarm template to it as well, so that we can fully view the result. If I apply that, what we will see now, instead of just having two elements in there, we also see that there are a number of parameter pages or data pages here popping up. And I can actually see there is a service severity here. There are certain alarms that I can activate monitoring and see all the alarms that are in here. And I have a list of all the elements that are included or not included, or in use or not in use, and their severity. And that actually allows me, this table, to do some monitoring on there. And what I defined, if I take a look at the alarm template, what I defined in the alarm template, I said in the state column, everything that includes main should go in alarm when it is not in use. So if it kicks over to the backup, then the main won't be in use and I want to generate an alarm. And that's exactly what I did here. The main device, it is not in use, so that's not such a good situation. So I want to generate an alarm on that. So now I can see that all of my elements inside this service are perfectly okay, and still I have an alarm on the service itself. If I check the alarm console, you will see that the business TV, the state Brussels main, is not used. So this is a potential problem that I need to take a look at, because we're running on the backup here. So this is actually a possibility to generate alarms on services. Previously, I did not mention that, but if I would of course generate, for instance, again, an alarm, or let me switch sides to the Paris, you would of course see the Paris is now currently doing the job. So these ones are now in my business TV. If I'm taking a look at the alarms of my Paris devices or elements, you can of course immediately see the business TV in the service impact column. So the services that it impacts is immediately indicated here. So that's also an additional advantage of adding that service layer to your DataMiner system while working with the alarms. You can generate service alarms, of course, but if you're working with element alarms, you can immediately see which services are impacted by this alarm, which services are using this element. So that's how you can create a service. So a basic service just combines the elements together. An enhanced service adds a layer on top of that. This is just a basic definition. You can do a lot more complicated calculations in a service definition file as well. So once I added that service, I do of course have the nice representation of all of my services with immediately a real-time view on how my service is performing at this point in time. I can open it up. I can see which elements are responsible for this service, where the potential problems are located, which ones are in use or not in use. And of course, in my alarm console, I can also see that service impact, or just drag and drop this service onto my alarm console to check alarm history, because alarm history is also nicely tracked along with the alarms. Also in the reporting, I can generate some nice reports to say, like, my business TV, how has it been behaving in the last day or week or month, have a number of alarms or alarm states, percentage of time, or a timeline, for instance. All of these things are nicely integrated, and I can of course send them, for instance, also by email to me on like a monthly basis. So that's adding a service layer to your DataMiner system. So that gives you that additional perspective. Not only the elements, the building blocks are being monitored, but also the actual services flowing through all of the elements dynamically are incorporated in those services and give you that nice service layer perspective of your DataMiner system there. I hope you enjoyed this one. See you in the next one.